Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Pranic Healing Podcast. On today's episode, we have Dr. Caitlyn Connor, and the topic that we're going to talk about is the impact of research on energy healing and how practitioners like yourself can contribute. So, Dr. Caitlyn holds a bachelor's degree from Mount Holyoke College with a dual focus in political science and anthropology. She also has a master's degree in acupuncture and oriental medicine from the Arizona School of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine, and also a doctorate in acupuncture and oriental medicine from the California Institute for Integral Studies and the American College of Traditional Chinese Medicine. So please welcome Dr. Caitlyn.
Hello.
Hi there, Dr. Caitlyn. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your deep insights and experience with research related to energy healing. This is a really kind of special podcast because not a lot of people know about research in energy healing. People might know there's been some studies, but I would love for us to kind of dive deep and explore how even practitioners can help and support in their own way, in their own fields as well. And before we get started, I would love for you, Dr. Caitlyn, for you to kind of introduce yourself on a more personal level and tell us about how you kind of got started in this, because this is, of course, not your traditional path. And with your extensive research career, it's very impressive. So I just want the audience to kind of get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah, I actually grew up doing energy healing, so it was just kind of always there. And because I grew up doing it, I knew it worked. My mom actually went into research first, and that was in no small part because what she was seeing with her energy healing practice and what the research was showing weren't matching up. I had the opportunity to start getting trained in research actually when I was in high school, which was very exciting. So I've been doing both in combination for, oh gosh, almost 15 years now.
Wow. And that's very early in high school. My goodness.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it sounds like your mom kind of really opened you up to it. I mean, especially with her background. So that's amazing how that pathway kind of presented itself for you. And I guess you kind of continued on that path, right? Based on your academics and your all your degrees, right?
Yeah. Acupuncture and Oriental medicine were an area that I hadn't gotten a lot of training at that point, and it feels to me, and this is an area of some debate in the research community, that if you're going to study something, you need to understand how it works before you start, so you know how to design the study, how you design the research to test what you think you're testing. So I went and got trained.
Wow, excellent. So that's great. And I think that you completed not only, I know extensively from just reading your bio, it's like acupuncture and oriental medicine, but you've done a lot of other things and you've gotten a lot of awards as well as, being a scientist as well. And because a lot of people think energy healing research is, again, a little bit maybe taboo still, right? It's not as grounded and evidence-based as other alternative modalities, but yeah, I would love for you to talk about all the awards and the training that you've completed even outside of the United States.
Yeah. So ISOM, International Society for the Study of Subtle Energies and Energy Medicine, for a very long time was the energy healing conference. And as I progressed in my research career, I got a couple of different awards from them. They were very, very kind. I do want to push back a little bit on the idea that there isn't a lot of research. We actually did some looking, and we pulled together a bibliography of 15,000 different research studies that are peer-reviewed and published. You can actually find the bibliography on naoep.org if you want to take a look.
Sure.
Not
And I'll list that for the audience, for the website,
yeah.
for people to look at. Yes.
Not all of them are well designed. Not all of them have positive results because of that. But we are developing an evidence base. In terms of difficult to test, it definitely can be. And there are some simple and some not so simple reasons for that.
Right.
A chunk of it is what I mentioned before, with people not understanding what they're testing. So much of what happens in research in the outcomes is based in how you design the study and how you communicate that design and what you're looking at to the people you're working with. So in an energy healing study, your providers are the practitioners. The people who are doing the intervention are the practitioners. And if you're not explaining to them what you're looking at, they're not necessarily going to be making a change in the area you're measuring.
Right. So that's an interesting, almost very subtle disconnect, because I think the traditional scientific method is it's almost like it's not as compatible with energy exploring the research and evidence in energy healing, energy work. It almost sounds like we have to be even more specific and more fine-tuned to make sure everyone's on the same page, which is maybe why, again, you're saying out of those 15,000 studies, not all of it is showing things going in one direction, which is maybe highlighting some of the missteps or challenges of studying this.
So, for example, Dr. Bill Bankston has done extensive research, especially on oncology. He's done a lot of research doing energy healing on cells in a petri dish. And one of my favorite studies of his, he did get results, but they weren't the results he was expecting. He was looking at measuring cell proliferation. So one of the things with oncology research you want to do is see a decrease in the number of cancer cells. That's how you determine success. He actually didn't see a decrease in the number of cancer cells, but what he did see was a shift in radiation as measured around the area.
And what does that mean for the lay folks? Radiation around the area. What does that mean?
So he saw a change in specific frequency ranges as measured in the physical environment. Mm-hmm. The cells did eventually wind up dying off. There's a bit more context for all of that. But the point that I'm trying to make is, if he was just measuring the one thing he was intending to look at, cell death, he wouldn't have gotten the additional information. He only got the additional information because he happened to be looking in multiple areas at the time.
Interesting. So it seems to me it's like, kind of this research. Of course, it's all new. Everyone's on the frontier, right? So we're discovering new things all the time. But it seems like to me, just thinking in my head, it's like you're walking into a dark room and you're thinking of finding this one object, and then you don't find it, but you find all these other objects that can help support and inform future studies. Is that kind of correct?
Yes. And some of it is the petting the elephant story. If you're patting the trunk, it's going to feel one way. If you're patting the tail, it's going to feel completely different. The way that you think, as someone who is both a practitioner and a researcher, the way you think about research, especially from an intervention perspective, is completely different from how you work with people as a practitioner.
And I really want to dive deep. Thank you for bringing that up, Dr. Caitlyn, because I really want to dive deep on that particular topic, because, like you mentioned, science has a completely different way of measuring and validating results versus to how you practice it. And I don't think it's anyone's fault. I think it's just the nature of what we're trying to do here. So can you talk a little bit about that and just give people context? Because I think that's a really, really important
Sure. So, as a practitioner, when you're working on an individual, you're working on that individual. You make changes as their presentation changes over time, and you do what they personally need in the moment. When you're looking at a research study, the first thing is to try and make sure that the population you're looking at is as narrow as possible, because that's the only way you're going to get any consistency in how you're doing the intervention. But the other thing is you have to do the same intervention every single time for every single person, no matter how different their current presentation is. It's just not how you practice. It's not how people practice Western medicine. It's not how people practice anything. But it's how you look at consistency across people and across time periods. So if someone has a slightly different presentation in a research study, you can't adjust the protocol.
I love the example of how even that's not how you practice Western medicine, right? And as we know, even in acupuncture, right, if someone comes into us with back pain, even though it might be symptomatically back pain, we can do a whole bunch of different treatment protocols based on what is the true root cause of their back pain, right? Sometimes it might be musculoskeletal, sometimes it might be something else. So I love the way that you described that and you brought that up, because a lot of practitioners might get confused when they start like, oh, I want to participate, I want to contribute, but then it's like, oh wait, I can't do what I do with my patients, I have to do it this one way. So can you give us an example of a proper study, like you mentioned, where you have a narrow population, you're focusing on one particular disease condition, you're looking for one particular outcome? What does that look like?
You've done the first step, which is identify the question. What is the thing you want to measure? And most of the time you're looking in an area, you've already done a certain amount of research, so you know how that is usually measured. If you don't, that's the next step, go find out. So you have a question, a thing you want to look at, and you have how you're going to look at it. The next step is identifying the population, and making it as narrow as possible. So one of the things in research that is a consistent push me, pull you is a thing called generalizability versus, gosh drat it, I am blanking on the word. Basically precision. How tightly you've defined the particular study. So if you're making your population as narrow as possible, you're going to have a population that fits the intervention as well as possible, but they're not necessarily going to be generalizable to the general public. You can't extrapolate. You also really don't have a choice about it if you're looking at using a specific method to deal with a specific problem. You have to have people that have that problem.
Can you give us an example to kind of ground what you're trying to say? I know I understand, but for like the audience, just to, I know that it's always better with examples.
So you were talking earlier about multiple causes of back pain.
Yes.
Don't just go with back pain, pick one of the causes. Because then you can specify the protocol for that cause, as opposed to taking someone who has a chi deficiency and attempting to deal with musculoskeletal pain. It's not going to work. You're not going to get the effect.
Okay. So what you're saying is, even though I'm choosing the symptom, which is back pain, we want to even narrow it down to the cause of the back pain. So let's say like osteoarthritis, right? That's a very specific mechanism of action for perhaps how the back pain can be attributed to manifesting.
And exactly. And you see this all of the time in drug research. Osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis aren't treated the same. You have to differentiate.
Okay. And then once we differentiate this, right, from what you're talking about, the generalization versus being more precise, where do we go about next?
Specify age range, and there's a thing called vulnerable populations. So you don't start doing research on pregnant women. You don't start doing research on anyone who may have issues with the ability to consent. So some mental health diagnoses, prison population, children, anything along those lines.
So it sounds like the exclusions
Yes.
criteria that
Yep.
might alter or affect the results based on some confounding factors already that they coming in with.
In this case, it's less confounding, though that is an important point. You very often start with a population that doesn't have other health issues, so you can really focus in on how it's affecting the one thing. It's just that, for example, pregnant women, how they react is very, very different because their hormones are different, and you can't assume that it's not going to affect the results and that it's not going to negatively affect the woman and the fetus.
Right.
And you really want to test things to make sure that that's not going to be a problem when you have the potential for a catastrophic result.
I wanted to kind of dive into that because when you say catastrophic results, and we know, in energy healing in general, I mean, most of the time you get positive results, but sometimes you'll get some, radical reactions. So is that what you're saying in terms of when things can kind of go wrong based not only in research, but in
I'm
practice
not
as well?
saying that it will. I'm saying you don't put a fetus at risk if you don't have to.
In general, right?
Yeah.
Right.
If nothing else, it's bad politics.
Yeah. Unless you're studying that specifically, which is already kind of tricky to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you'd specifically have to recruit for people who were trying to get an abortion and were willing to lose the pregnancy as a result. And that is, first of all, going to be a very small population.
And a very interesting study question, let
Yeah.
alone, yeah.
The other thing that we haven't mentioned yet is HIPAA. Sorry, not, I'm swapping acronyms. IRB. There we go.
IRB. Yes,
Yes.
that's a very important part of research because that's what you even need to begin with. So please explain for
Yes.
the audience what it is in IRB and why is it so important?
So IRB stands for Institutional Review Board. It's the human ethics board, or depending on the type of study you're doing, they also can look at animal research. They're making sure that the study design doesn't put the humans or the animals at an unnecessary degree of risk, that all of your documentation goes through the risks basically adequately and in small enough words that everyone can understand it. We really want to make sure that people know what they're getting into when they agree to participate. It's important to consider as you're entering the research process that the rules around IRBs have changed significantly in the past 40 years. So a lot of the people who are doing research were trained on older models where IRBs were a lot less mandatory. And not all of them have been updated on the legal changes. So there are a couple of places, largely NIH places, where you can look around to find out what the changes in research rules are, and they do change periodically. If you want to update yourself and if you have any concerns about how things are being managed as you're working with a researcher.
Yeah, thank you for talking about that because I think when I think of IRB, it's like when you work with any human, basically you kind of need that external review to make sure everything is, as it should be, and hopefully protecting the participants and making sure that both sides understand what's going on. And like
Exactly.
you've mentioned, a lot of this is by the nature of how the IRB kind of came about, a lot of things need to be updated. And, talking about the things being updated, I think research on energy healing has really, you know, required that, right? An updated view on how we can effectively, efficiently, but also in an evidence-based manner to look at research for energy healing. So, I want to kind of continue. So we have an IRB board. We talked about, the sort of scientific process of studying research on for energy healing and kind of going with the example of, let's say, lower back pain, right? And we're
Yep.
studying, maybe an intervention for osteoarthritis, which is the cause of the lower back pain. And we have these, participants, they signed up, the IRB went through. What do we do next after that?
So you've identified how you're measuring changes. Is it a pain scale? Is it a questionnaire? If it is a questionnaire, you're specifically going to want one that's normed, which is a technical term and means that it's gone through a bunch of research to say that it has consistent results.
Mm.
That's it. That it just means that the results you get from the questionnaire are probably accurate. You can also, if you're talking about something like osteoarthritis, look at range of movement, because very often you'll have a decrease in range of movement. You can also look at secondary measures, like has their sleep improved? You might be able to look at physical measures like blood perfusion. You'll often get changes in capillary dilation with pain. So you can look at things that are really concrete, as well as the more subjective things like pain. But even with pain, you can look in a more concrete manner. Now, there is a difference between qualitative and quantitative.
Right. I was just going to ask that because
Yeah.
I think some people like to think, oh, if we have both qualitative and quantitative, does that make the research better than just having like a pain, not pain scale, but like range of motion? Because that's very
Yeah.
objective, right? Versus qualitative is like pain and stress and sleep, right?
Yeah. So combination, technical term, mixed methods. And the answer is it's complicated.
Mm.
Most journals will focus on one or the other. And there's still very much a bias towards quantitative and numbers in research and in, frankly, most medicine.
Mm.
Not to say that there isn't a place for client and participant experiences. There absolutely is. Having done some looking at doing qualitative research, it's also a nightmare to analyze.
Right, because it's a lot more, I would assume, complicated to make those connections from one study to another study, versus
You're,
something objective like range of motion. Like that's across the board. You can find out it was this degree, this angle that it changed or improved, right?
even within a study, say
Mm.
you have 100 people and you're doing range of motion, you're looking at two numbers. How much do these two numbers change? I mean, you're looking at more than two, but beginning versus endpoint, you have two numbers, and how much of a change is there between them? When you're looking at qualitative, you're looking at linguistic changes. So, did the number of pain words that they use change? How do you define a pain word? Are they using happier languaging?
Mm.
You really need to know what you're doing. It takes a lot more effort to do. It's valuable work, because one of the things that absolutely is getting ignored is patient experiences, client experiences in a healthcare process. But you have to pay attention to how much work the data analysis is going to be.
It sounds like almost you kind of have to think about the fence and fencing off and getting everything, tidy and organized. Because if you don't, it can really kind of overflow with, qualitative types of data. Because like you said, it's even the words that you described, like, oh wow, I've never thought about that in terms of like the types of words paintings
Yeah.
that use or the frequency and things like that. So
The other thing you have to look at is how you're gathering the data. Are you having people journaling? How likely are they to actually do that? Are you setting up interviews? How likely are they to come in and actually set aside the time to do the interview. Are you recording the interview? How are you documenting the information? There's a whole other aspect that you have to pay attention to with qualitative.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of back end work just to be. It almost requires to be very detail oriented, right? Because, like you said, this is we're talking about within a study, and when we talk
Yep.
about comparing other studies, that's a whole, I'm sure, a different animal, because that's even more challenging, I would assume.
Yeah.
Okay, so kind of continuing on our little research journey here. So let's say we do go with like a mixed method study, right? We have qualitative and quantitative data after doing the research intervention. What happens next?
Get the data, analyze the data. I highly recommend hiring a statistician, but that is in no small part because I am terrible at math.
Hmm.
There are people who do that professionally. Bless them.
Right.
I also personally find, on a slightly different note, that having a disconnect between the person doing the statistics, the analysis, and the people doing the data gathering increases the validity of the study. It increases how well the study is accepted.
Because of bias, maybe? Based
Basically,
on,
yeah.
because when I think of statistics, I mean, I would assume that for, let's say, for the people developing the study, they have already an idea of what statistical methods to use. Are they telling the statistician, hey, I wanted these data to be analyzed this way, or does the statistician just do a very like third party objective, like I'll analyze all of this and I'll just give you all of this?
It depends. So one of the things that I didn't mention is very often when you're setting up how you're doing the data gathering, it's a good idea to talk to the statistician ahead of time because they will tell you if you are setting yourself up for statistical problems.
What does that mean, statistical problems? Are you
So
saying that the researcher will run into like some problems because this will conflict with this?
not necessarily. So
Okay.
for example, there's something called an effect size, which is how many people you need to be able to see a particular change. So if you're talking to a statistician, and there are some general rules, which we'll get into in just a minute, but if you're talking to a statistician and you have the amount of change you're expecting, say a 20% improvement, to pick a random number out of a hat, they can look at it and tell you, okay, you need this number of people to be able to see that change. And the smaller amount of change you're expecting, the more people you're going to need to see it. But you also get into things like type 1 errors, which I frankly don't understand. I'm not a statistician. They're wonderful people. It makes no sense to me. But there are these little math traps that you can fall into with the way that you set up your data collection. And if you talk to a statistician before you start gathering data, they can warn you about them.
I see. So this sounds like it's not even research and energy handling. This is in general, right?
Across the
Just
board. Yeah.
across the board, this is just
Yeah.
good practice to kind of have communication with the statistician to avoid these
Yes.
kind of pitfalls.
Yeah. Oh, the number thing I was talking about earlier. General rule is of threes. So 3 people is pilot study, 30 people, you can start to get a power analysis, 300, and you're talking about actual data.
And when you say actual data, what does that mean?
You're starting to look at enough people that you can actually generalize what you're getting. 30 people, you can do a power analysis. You can say that there's something going on. 300 people, you can say you probably have an idea of what.
Interesting. Okay, and that's where we're talking about the size, the population,
Yeah.
which is very important. Okay, so yeah, let's say we'll continue and finish off the example. Like we have the study. It maybe showed the 20% improvement from across the board, and say 300 participants. What happens next? What do we do with this data?
So you've gotten it analyzed by the statistician. So you have all of the pretty graphs and a p-value or a Cohen's D, or however they've decided to do the numbers. Again, really not my area. You submit it to a journal. Now, there's a lot of different ways of doing this. You can, first thing is pull a list of journals that publish in the area you did the research. So if you're doing an energy healing study into osteoarthritis, you can look at arthritis journals. You can look at specifically osteoarthritis journals. You can look at integrative med journals. You can look at energy healing specific journals. There's a range. And you can actually write the study from different perspectives, depending on who you're submitting the journal to. So every journal is going to have basically a style guide. They'll have a list of sections they want, what they want in the sections. Check the journal that you're looking at submitting it to and write it to that. Especially when you're looking at references, how they do the references, there's a real range. If they want them in alphabetical, if they want them numbered, it changes all the time. But the other thing you have to keep in mind is how expensive the journal is. Journals across the board at this point in time are paid, and some of them get to be really, really expensive.
But do you mean that when we submit, we have to pay to get accepted by this journal to be published?
Not when you submit. If you get accepted, you have to pay for them to publish it.
Okay. And what is the value? What does it range from?
Let's see. IJHC, International Journal of Healing and Caring, is a journal that I'm affiliated with. It's $500. JAMA is a couple thousand. So there's quite a range.
Right. Now, yes, please continue.
Basically what you're paying for is legitimacy, how established the journal is and how many people are going to see it.
Yes, because I was going to ask, some journals have a quote unquote better reputation than others, hence why maybe price may be a little bit higher compared to others. But what is that perspective in terms of, should we submit this and hopefully get this published in as many journals as possible, or should we focus on just a few or even one journal to kind of maintain the credibility of whatever, us, the research organization or the institute that is conducting this research? What is the take on that?
It depends on what you're trying to do. If you have, for lack of a better term, a landmark study, something that is going to impact how things are done going forward. The consort report, for example, went through how research articles were written, what kind of information was included, and what kind of information largely wasn't, and what information has to be included in order to have a study be replicable. So one of the things in research is, can you reproduce a particular study? And if you're not including all of the necessary information in the article, you're not going to be able to reproduce it because people don't know what information they're missing. So Consort is an organization. They wrote up an article looking at what information needed to be included in an article so that you could replicate the study. Landmark article. They've actually now done a series on different types of articles. If you have something like that, put it somewhere that everybody's going to see it. If you have something smaller, where you do something that's maybe interesting on a particular piece was interesting looking at the osteoarthritis, and another piece was interesting at how you designed the energy healing intervention. And another piece was interesting because of the way you managed the data gathering. You can focus on each of those pieces in smaller journals that are more focused.
Interesting. So again, this is a not so simple, even getting to the last part, we're like, okay, we completed the study. I thought this was the hardest part. It sounds like there's even more legwork to be found, even when you're done at the finish line. So
doing the study is the easy part. Writing it up is always the hard part. It's always more specific than you think.
Interesting. And, for a lot of the audience, I hope from the outside looking in, you can appreciate the work that it gets to even, you know, getting this started and all the way till the end. And, I kind of wanted to shift the conversation now that we kind of have an idea about the process of research on energy healing from kind of the A to Z point. How can how can practitioners contribute? Because I think that a lot of people, of course, there's many more practitioners to researchers, right? That ratio.
Yeah.
But how can practitioners, Dr. Caitlin, help support this work, this movement? Because it is, as we know, very necessary. Even though there is a large body of evidence already, to support it, to make it stronger, right? To show that this works and hopefully have it implemented on a larger scale.
So there's a couple of different options depending on how much work, time, and effort you want to put in. The easiest is just find someone doing research on energy healing in your area and talk to them. See if they have a study that you could potentially join. They're going to be designing the protocol in that case. You may or may not have input into how they set up the actual intervention. Which does mean that you don't have a lot of control over what you're doing in the research study, and that can have its downsides. But it does require you to do the least amount of effort. The other option is to start doing research on your own. Now, once you get past a certain size of research study, you really want, so the person in charge of a research study is called the PI, the principal investigator. You really want the people doing the intervention to not be the principal investigator. There's a long list of reasons for that, not least of which is frankly the experimenter effect. But also just the fact that doing energy healing and doing research are fundamentally different ways of thinking. It's really hard to switch back and forth. But once you get down to a certain size, it's not really a problem. So you can do a case study. It's a single person study. It's an in-depth look at everything going on with a specific individual and everything you do to that specific individual and how it changes.
And I was going to say, so if you're participating in this, let's see, you're the practitioner in this case, doing the case study, would you need to find a different PI, or
nope.
you can do this yourself?
That's what I was talking about, the size difference. If you're doing a case study, it's just you, by and large. Okay. You can talk to a researcher and get their perspective, but generally it is one person doing the study on one person. Having said that, I do know of a couple case studies that were done with a team working on a single person because it was a mixed intervention. But by and large, it's going to be a single person working on a single person.
So that's the easiest way for anyone to start out. And I'm sure there's proper ways to document this, to record the data, to, all of that, because that's just the proper way to set up a case study, right?
Yes. And when you're talking about case studies, it does get complex. So the first thing is CITI training, CITI program. I think it's .com, it might be .org, but it's human ethics. It's one sec. Sorry. It's the ethics training for research.
Right, because I remember myself when I was in, undergrad and grad school, even just being a research assistant, I had to go through that myself.
Exactly. There is a bit of a question at this point in energy healing research, whether practitioners are part of the research team or whether they're not, basically, and thus whether they have to go through the ethics testing. and
Mm.
be on the IRB and all of those things. Personally, I'm on the side of they're doing the thing. So they need the ethics testing and they need to be on the IRB.
Now,
Like,
what would be the other argument? Why wouldn't they need to be on why wouldn't they need to do ethics testing?
um, honestly, it's not an argument that's ever made sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's an argument that they are the subjects of the research. If they're providing the intervention, I don't see how they're the subjects of the research, but
Mm.
that is one that I've heard at this point in time. I know of a couple of studies where they didn't specify who. So they specified that someone was getting, for example, an energy healing, but they didn't specify who they were going to or what was being done, in which case the practitioners weren't considered part of the research team.
Mm.
I have a lot of problems with designing it that way just because you don't know what's being done. You don't know that
It's
they're working
very
on this
ambiguous. I was
particular
just
thing.
gonna say that I don't
Yeah,
know what's going on.
yes.
Okay,
It's the
interesting.
level of not control that I'm not comfortable with in a research environment. It's that simple.
Yeah, that makes sense. Mm.
So my particular stance is get the ethics training. City program is wonderful. They have a lot of different tests at this point. They've been expanding and narrowing down exactly what each of the tests focus on. Last time I looked, I think the test was about $150, but they do change it periodically, so don't quote me on that. Depending on where you live, they'll be good for different amounts of time. It's based out of Miami. So Florida, it's good for 1 year. I live in Arizona, it's good for 2 years.
Mm.
It
Okay,
depends.
depends. So
Um, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I just wanted to, if you're done with your thought on that, because I wanted to kind of connect back to sort of the practitioner's journey on contributing to research, because the city training is one aspect of
Yes.
it when we think about doing research, and we were talking about case studies and how they were the easiest to start. And I know case studies can be built, right? So there's a
Yeah.
case series, and then I think there's like cohorts, right?
Yes.
um can
The important difference between case studies or case studies in series is, and a pilot study, is that you're not working on multiple people with the same issue at the same point in time. It's
okay.
really just timing. Just,
Can you give us an example?
um, finish one before you start the next. If you're working
Mm.
on two people on the same issue at the same point in time and you're doing the same intervention,
Mm.
then you're verging into pilot study territory and the rules get very different.
Mm.
You
Okay.
don't need an IRB for a case study. It's not a bad idea to have one, but they do get expensive,
Right.
but it's not required. As soon as you get into pilot study, it is federally required.
Okay. That's a big difference there.
Yes.
Um, so it sounds like the easiest and best way to start is just to do the case study.
Yes.
Okay. And for practitioners out there, are there, like we talked about, resources to how they can
Um,
write up one?
Yeah, naoep.org again has a full research protocol, including how to do case studies. If you're
Okay.
interested, they also have a bunch of researchers listed that you can contact if you have questions or if you want to work with someone.
And I will
Um,
list that below for the audience as a link
yeah.
for research.
NIH also has a ton of resources.
Okay.
If you look at their research tab, they have a lot of information available.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Caitlin. I think that the conversation we had today was, very important, and it kind of took us through the gamut of, the challenges, and but sort of the success that can come from doing great, efficient, effective research in energy healing, right?
I'm sorry, can I add one piece quickly?
Yes, please.
Nine case studies is considered an evidence base. So if you do
Hmm.
either yourself or in combination with other people, 9 single case studies on a particular issue, it sets the tone for how interventions, how energy healing research on that particular area is done in the future.
Hmm. Okay. So, can you give us an example? Say, so 9 different people doing 9 different case studies on the same condition is considered, like you said, what was the word?
Evidence base.
Evidence based. Okay.
So if you, for example, get 9 case studies on energy healing, and generally you do want to, again, be as narrow as possible, so say pranic, and you're focusing all of them specifically on osteoarthritis. If someone in the future goes and does a larger study on osteoarthritis, those case studies are considered an evidence base. They'll set up their design based on how you did the case studies.
Hmm. Interesting.
One of
So it's like
one
a
of
reference point. Yeah.
Yes, one of the major problem, and it helps them get funding. Research is a lot more expensive than most people expect. All of the testing, all of the time involved costs money. So it's a lot easier to get funding if there's already an evidence base for something going on. You guys got results in these case studies. There's something to look at. We can make an argument that someone should give us money to go do more looking. Um, One of the problems we have in energy healing research is how the studies are designed. So if you set up a bunch of case studies, 9 case studies is an evidence base. If you set up 9 case studies, you've defined how the research in that area is going to be done going forward. We don't have to worry about people messing it up.
Hmm. So what you're saying is that if the research methods is the same, I assume, across the board from these 9 case studies, that sets up better for the future when doing bigger studies.
It doesn't have to be identical, but
Okay.
things like so one of the problems with acupuncture research is how often the intervention is delivered. Very often people will set up studies where they're seeing people, say, once a month and are shocked that they're not getting any results. Go figure.
Right.
So one of the things you can define is how often the person is getting seen for an issue so that they're getting seen enough that they actually get a change.
Yeah, that's a very important factor that not a lot of people might think about in the beginning. Right. Okay. So thank you for that. That's amazing. So I think that that's very important as well for, I think all modalities, organizations that are trying to start and build up, their research base. So it sounds like case studies and getting them once you get past that magic number 9 is a great starting point for building that foundation.
And it doesn't have to be the same practitioner. It can be 9 practitioners each doing one. The point is just to get the research started.
Well, I think that that's the conversation we had today, right? Just getting the research started and the
Yes.
impact of doing it the right way, starting off saves you a lot of headaches and troubles later down the line. And as you outlined, Dr. Caitlyn, that's research is expensive. It's very time consuming. So, it's better if we do it as efficiently and effectively as possible.
It's a lot harder to convince people to let you do a research study if someone else did it wrong the first time around and didn't find anything.
Exactly. So yeah, that's I think that's such a great point because again, it's a lot of this is trial and error, right? But and especially when we're talking about energy healing, something that again, towards like mainstream media and social awareness might not be as recognized. But as you mentioned, there's a large body of peer-reviewed studies, right? I think you said 15,000 and growing.
Oh.
So it's out there. And if you're interested in doing research, like Dr. Caitlyn mentioned, we will list all the resources down below for how you can kind of get started that way. So before we close off, Dr. Caitlyn, do you have any general words of advice to our audience in general about research and how practitioners can contribute just based on your experience?
Never believe the media, always read the actual study.
I like it. Simple. because
It's
it sounds like you can twist the results of the study based on how the media writes it.
um oh fudge, who was it? I think it was Anne Baldwin. Dr. Anne Baldwin has a lot of research studies. She did a research study in a shielded environment looking to see whether or not people could produce energy, um, basically inside a Faraday cage.
Mm,
And the answer was that they couldn't, which the skeptics ran with because their assumption was if people inside a Faraday cage can't produce energy, obviously it means that they can't anywhere. And Dr. Baldwin was very firmly clear in the article of the opinion that it backed up what energy practitioners said that they were pulling from the ground, and obviously couldn't do that through a Faraday cage. It's
mm,
incredibly easy. Most people writing news articles aren't trained in science. That's not their job. Writing is.
right.
So it's incredibly easy sometimes to misunderstand the information. And when you're getting it filtered third hand,
Yeah, that's very interesting, and thank you for bringing up that example. Because I've first I didn't hear about that study, and it's very interesting. I'm gonna look into it. But two,
yeah,
it just goes to highlight almost like the ethics of kind of reporting based on media. I mean, I guess there's different legalities to that, but how you can spin the results to a certain narrative, based
even
on
if it's not
yeah,
deliberate, you have to
yeah,
remember that this isn't their area of expertise. They're
right.
translating from one thing that they don't necessarily understand completely to other people who also don't have the area of expertise. If you go back to the research study, a lot of it's not going to translate well, 5-letter words that are giant. But you at least get, if you read the conclusion, you at least get a general idea of what they did and what the results were.
Which is back to our point why it's so important for us to continue building this body of research to show all the different facets that energy healing is part of, right? And the one that you mentioned, right, pulling energy from the ground, which a lot of practitioners already know, but from the outside it might not be so obvious. So that's a great point, and thank you for sharing that. That's something I'm going to keep in the back of my mind too, just because again, it's not how truth can be marketed in different ways. So, and it's important to know what is the actual truth. So you have to look at, like you said, look at the article, look at the research. So thank you so much, Dr. Caitlyn. I really had a wonderful conversation today, just for myself, in general, selfishly, just kind of learning about, the research process and how people like me, as a practitioner, can get started and can contribute. And again, I think that the work that you're doing, especially with your organizations, especially with your mom, Dr. Melinda Connor, is so amazing. And on behalf of our audience, we would thank you from the bottom of our hearts, because this work is pivotal, and it's very much kind of a grassroots movement, and it will continue, I'm sure, to surge and grow. And like you said, just starting off the right way makes things so much easier down the line. And I think that you guys have provided so much resources over the years for all of us as practitioners. So we thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening to this episode of the Pranic Healing Podcast. And we hope to see you all in the next episode. Thank you.